Yes, we'll recommence, Mr. Parrish. What's on the agenda for today?
Thank you, Commissioner. I foreshadowed yesterday that there was some witness shuffling going on due to unavailabilities. Our first witness today will be Ian Reynolds, and thanks to the hard work of Ms. Hewson and the convenience of Jim Clark, he will be our next witness. He's kindly agreed to be moved up to today.
Yes, well, I do appreciate that. I understand the inconvenience of all witnesses who are summoned to come along, so that's appreciated. So do you think we'll finish by lunchtime?
It appears that way at this stage, yes.
Yes, all right. Yes, you proceed.
I call Mr. Ian Reynolds.
Yes.
Mr. Reynolds, you are required to give your evidence either by virtue of an affirmation or an oath. Which would you prefer?
An oath?
Do you swear that the evidence you're about to give to this inquiry will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. Yes, Mr. Parrish.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Reynolds, can we start with your background, both personal and vocational?
I've worked for probably, 30 or 40 years in the public sector, both state and local. I was at Blacktown Council for 21 years, culminating in 5 or 6 years as General Manager, prior to going back to the state public sector in senior executive positions. I retired from the state sector in 2012 and set up my own consulting practice, concentrating on the areas of strategic land use planning and local government and state government governance process reviews and those sorts of things. In that capacity, I was approached by the government to oversee some of the merger inquiries for the councils in 2015-16, and subsequently I was appointed as administrator of the newly merged Central Coast Council, and subsequent to that have done some specialist temporary advising at councils like Blue Mountains and ultimately at Wingecarribee.
Yes, you were appointed temporary advisor on the same day as the performance improvement order was issued. That's correct.
Yes,
and that was 8 September 2020.
Yes, that's true.
And you provided a report on what you had done as temporary advisor on 18 December 2020. Is that correct?
I think that's the date, yes.
I'll show you a copy of that. I'll ask you some questions about it, and if you've got it in front of you, it'll make things a bit easier.
Yep.
It's page 215 of Tender Bundle B.
Sorry, Mr. Parrish, Exhibit B 215?
215.
Thank you.
I have it here.
Thank you. The first page in sets out the recommendations on page 216.
Yes.
We might come back to those. Can I start by taking you to page 4, which is at page 219 of the bundle?
Yes.
And can you tell us what your role was as temporary advisor?
My role, at the request of the Minister, was to attend and observe council meetings and advise on meeting process and monitor the council's compliance with the performance improvement order in that respect. It was indicated at the outset that I should attend at least 3 meetings. In the ultimate, I attended the mayoral election meeting, special meeting, and I attended 6 meetings, 6 I think, yes, and also had one-on-one phone interviews with a number of the councillors who wished to speak with me.
Did you have occasion to review any of the previous meetings that were online, either prior to you physically attending them or digitally attending the actual meetings?
No, I didn't, partly because of just circumstances at the time, and also it wasn't really, I didn't feel in a position to be able to pick and choose meetings that I might want to see, so I thought I should approach the job de novo, as it were.
And did you meet with the Mayor and the Acting General Manager and the Deputy General Manager of Corporate Strategy and Development prior to those first meetings, or was that?
I did attend here to introduce myself to the Mayor, the Acting General Manager and the Deputy General Manager on the day before the mayoral meeting, as I recall, 22nd of September, I think it was,
Yes.
just to introduce myself and to gain an understanding from their perspective of the nature and the origins of where the council was at the time.
Can you give me your impressions of those first three meetings that you attended?
I don't know that I kept detailed records in my report either. Generally speaking, I was after a bit of I suppose, an impression from each of the three as to how they saw their role going in the council. The overall impression I got, I would summarise as certainly a strong sense of disunity in the elected body. Also, probably a sense of a disjoint between the senior staff and at least some of the elected body. And as events subsequently played out, I think those observations were sustained, I suppose would be the right word.
Yes. If you go over to page 5 of the report, there's some observations arising from those first three meetings there. Can you explain?
Can I just clarify? Those first three meetings are the first three council meetings?
Yes.
Rather than those staff?
Pardon me. Yes.
Sorry, yes.
So your evidence just then was your general impressions from meeting with the Mayor, the Acting General Manager and the Group Manager of Governance. Is that correct?
Yes. In the ultimate, even though the request for my services related to seeing three meetings, I felt that wasn't going to be enough. So I ended up, as I say, looking at 6 or 7.
Yes.
So I made observations out of the first 3, subsequently met with the Mayor and the Acting General Manager to advise them of the outcome of my observations and some recommendations for improvement. And then in my own mind, I wanted to see how those suggestions for improvement played out in the next few meetings that I observed. So that page there summarises the observations I made at those first 3 council meetings.
Yes. So the first of your observations from those first 3 meetings is that there was a lack of clarity around process which enabled game playing and facilitated unhelpful verbal exchanges. Can you explain to the Commissioner what you mean by game playing?
Some of my comments, I guess, are in the context of the meetings I observed were online. 2 circumstances. One, this chamber was being remodelled, I understand, so they couldn't meet here, but also because of COVID, the Mayor was the only councillor in attendance physically at the council. My understanding is that some of the other councillors were, inverted commas, in the council building, but not in the chamber, so they were also online. Because there were at odd times some quite substantial technical difficulties which didn't help the running of the meetings. There were particular circumstances, and some of the council had given a direction at some stage, I can't recall when, but it would have been before my starting, that councillors shouldn't use a digital background because it was interfering with the voting process, for example. Despite that direction, one councillor, during my whole time, I think, insisted on having a digital background. So because of that, technically, I don't understand the technicalities, but any time he wanted to raise his hand or put up a voting card, it flared. I could see what the mayor was seeing. So the mayor was not in a position to actually know that that councillor wished to speak or had voted a particular way. My observation at the time was that that councillor felt that he was being victimised or not paid due regard by the mayor.
Yes.
When in fact it was a technical difficulty. So there are issues like that. But one of the difficulties I found with their process, which I did talk to the mayor and the GM about, the acting general manager, was it was a very loose or opaque process around the actual moving of motions. Items would come up for discussion, there'd be discussion, there might be a public speaker come in, then they would have the council staff talk about the issue. During discussion, councillors would indicate very loosely that they wanted to move something. They wouldn't formally move. So when it actually got to the discussion about moving, the mayor would call for a motion, and then there would be disagreements. The councillor who'd mentioned it in passing said, well, I've already moved something. So there would be a debate about who had the right of moving and seconding. That difficulty arose because of the in my inverted commas, messy process around the actual introduction of individual items. I felt that, for example, that if council staff were to brief the councillors on a business paper item, that briefing ought to be held separately to the actual determination meeting, the meeting where it was deliberated on. That briefing can be public if the council wants it to be, but it gets that advice and discussion process out of the debate process. And I felt that that would have been helpful. So that's the sort of issue that was behind my comment there. And the mayor, obviously as chair of the meeting, whenever there was an issue or a disagreement, he has to intervene. So it just encouraged increased the need for the mayor to intervene, where otherwise, if the process had been more formalised, cut and dried, it wouldn't have happened, in my view.
Do I take it from the word game playing in that context, you form the impression that some councillors were using that lack of clarity to intentionally make it messy?
I did form that impression, yes.
And in respect of that messiness, was that in any way caused by a gap or uncertainty in the code of meeting practice? Or was that a matter of the code of meeting practice was sufficiently clear and it was not being followed?
I think it would be more the latter.
We might talk a bit more about that in due course.
Are you moving to a different topic?
I was moving to a different topic in the sense I was moving to the next sentence.
While I've interrupted you, I may as well ask my question. One thing that can be seen in some of those meetings, and it I think relates to the issue of loose procedure about motions, there being debates about who would move and who would second a motion. Did you observe things like that?
I did.
And is that something that happens in councils, in your experience?
No, not generally.
Does it tell one something about the processes and the efficiencies of meetings
I suppose the answer is yes, it does.
And what's your view about that?
My view is that the lack of process, processes are there to help an outcome be achieved efficiently, fairly and transparently. The fact that there was that lack of process around the procedure enabled the debate to concentrate on non-issues, like who had the right of moving and who was the seconder, those sorts of things, rather than the nub of the issue that they might have been talking about. I'm a person who likes process by my nature, by my training, by
Yes.
my background,
Yeah.
because it serves a good outcome. And if it's not observed in practice, then the outcomes can be either messy, delayed, protracted, etc.
And is it a shared responsibility of all councillors to adhere to proper process in a meeting?
Yes, I think so, in my view.
And does the chair have
And the staff.
And the staff, yes. And does the chair have a particular role to play in that?
Yes, the chair does, in my view,
Yes.
as a controller of the meeting.
Yes.
Assisted, I think, in local government, the role of chair, being the mayor, in my mind and in my experience, involves a good working relationship with the, in this case, the acting general manager, and in normal times, the general manager.
Yeah. Thank
Working
you.
together to chair the meeting effectively.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
The second sentence of your first observation, you refer to the conflation of questions, statements and moving motions. Is that effectively the same observation you were talking about in respect of the debates that were being had about
Yes,
who's going to move
yes,
something?
yes.
Okay, thank you. The second observation that you had was that on occasion the mayor contributed to debate without vacating the chair, which compromised his ability to chair the meeting at those stages. Can you explain why it's necessary to vacate the chair and what effect there is if it's not done?
The mayor is, in the context of a council meeting, the mayor is chairing the meeting. In my view, it's not appropriate for the chair of a meeting to be entering the debate, one side or another, whilst in the chair. In my normal experience, if the mayor felt the need to contribute to a debate, he or she would vacate the chair in favour of the deputy mayor, usually, to sit in the chair and then have their say. And so the meeting could be chaired by somebody else while the mayor was contributing to the debate. It's difficult to do both. If you're intervening to speak in a partisan way on an issue, it's difficult to maintain the appearance of impartiality as chair. So in my view, the roles ought to be kept separate. So if the mayor needs to speak, then he or she should vacate the chair. I did raise that issue, I recall, with the mayor and the acting GM. And the general response I got was, well, that's the way we do it here. I got the understanding that had been a long-standing practice. So it was embedded in the way the meetings normally ran.
Is there a good reason why the mayor, as chair, ought not to contribute to the debate whilst sitting in the chair?
I think, well, it just the mayor's role in the meeting is to chair the meeting. If he wishes to speak, then he takes himself out of the chair. Someone else then chairs the meeting while he speaks. That's my view, as the proper procedure.
Did you have occasion to observe in the meetings that you saw councillors asking the mayor when he was in the chair how he intended to vote on a certain issue prior to the debate or the vote on it being conducted?
thinking back, I can't remember that being raised, although I would say that the fact that the Mayor spoke on an issue several times was a clear indicator of the way he was going to vote anyway. There may well have been discussions before meetings that I wasn't party to where that was made known, but where there were split votes, it was usually the same split. So my observation was that people would generally have a view, some understanding of the way voting might go.
If I ask you to assume, therefore, that on occasion councillors did ask prior to the vote how the Mayor intended to use a casting vote, would that be appropriate in your view, in the meeting procedure context?
I wouldn't favour that practice. I mean, the voting is the process that shows where you're voting.
Yes. Your third observation was that there was no use made of en bloc motion process in any observed meeting, resulting in the need to separately consider all items.
That's correct.
Even when there was no debate or difference of views between councillors. Can you explain what an en bloc motion is?
Yes, en bloc is where all councillors are of the same mind about an issue. Then most councils that I've observed or been in will move that portion of the business paper in one motion, so it's adopted usually at the beginning of the meeting. A council I was involved in at Blacktown, for example, they would do it slightly differently. They would call for extractions. So councillors would nominate which item they wanted to speak on, and by default all the rest were then passed as a single motion. It's really, it's an efficiency process really in terms of the meeting time, particularly if there are public involved watching the meeting. To be able to deal with items that are not contentious in that way is an efficiency measure. I did raise that with the Mayor and the AGM as a potential improvement measure, and the response, if I recall correctly, was along the lines of, we may well spend more time arguing about what we agree on than actually debating them, so they didn't do it.
That was going to be my next question. Does using the en bloc process require some planning, preparation and, to an extent, cooperation prior to the meeting?
Look, it is a cooperative practice, yes. One of my suggestions that I recall to the Mayor and the GM was that if there were issues, like if the councillors wished to have briefings on things, they would have them before the meeting, and during that process they might form a view that they're all of one mind, so that the recommendation can be moved as part of a block motion. So it does require an effective working relationship between the councillors, yes, in my view.
Not only, well, tell me if this is right, the en bloc motion process is one that requires cooperation, but shouldn't cooperation be part of the meeting process in any event?
Desirably, yes.
Yes. And does the en bloc motion process... No, I'll withdraw that. Thank you. You've already answered that.
In your opinion and experience, is there an obligation on councillors to be cooperative and take steps to ensure the efficient conduct of a meeting, both in the meeting itself and in the run-up or preparation to a meeting?
In my experience, cooperation is a good thing, yes. Both within and before.
Yes. Now, number 4 of your observations, I think we've covered the
Yes, we have, yes.
digital background issue. You also observed at 5 that on occasion the mayor appeared unsure as to the process and needed to be assisted by the acting general manager as to order of proceedings, correct process, etc.
Yes.
Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, if I take the first meeting I observed, for example, was the mayoral election, and the council had previously resolved the method of voting, but it had needed to re-resolve that at the meeting to comply with the regulations. So it was to be by open voting. So that needed to be done. That was clearly set out in the business paper. The mayor, I think there was, in response to, I think, to an issue raised by one of the councillors absent from the building, raised the issue about some of the councillors being in the building but online and how that impacted on proceedings. The mayor proceeded to say how the voting was going to happen, which wasn't actually the way the council had previously resolved, nor was recommended in the business paper. So the acting general manager had to, after the mayor had given his explanation of how things were going to go, the AGM had to intervene and say, well, actually no, this is the way it's going to happen. And that was, I recall that sort of event happening in a number of occasions, not as specifically as that one, because that really stuck in my mind, given the singular nature of the meeting.
In your experience, when one is chairing a meeting and there might be a doubt or even a temporary brain fade as to what the appropriate process is, how, in your view, should that be dealt with?
Well, I've chaired a number of meetings myself. If I'm not sure, I'll just say, well, I'm not sure. I'll ask so-and-so. The general manager is there, and councillors are members of the community. I don't think it's necessarily fair to expect them to be across all the details of how things ought to run, but you would expect the staff to be across those details. So, as we've talked about cooperation, I think there needs to be a good working relationship between the mayor and the general manager, stroke acting general manager in this case. If I'm unsure as mayor, I would defer to the general manager. I would openly say, I'll ask the general manager to respond. Or if I'm the general manager and I see that the mayor is in difficulty, inverted commas, I would actively intervene myself and say, Mr. Mayor, maybe I can enlighten the situation, or something like that. I know when I was general manager with my mayor, I had several mayors. We had a cooperative working relationship at the head of the meeting, and I could just give a signal to the mayor that I'll take this one, I'll take this answer, to try to assist the running of the meeting. So we've talked about cooperation with councillors, it's cooperation with the staff as well.
Was there a concomitant code or signal back from the mayor to you as general manager when he or she
it's a two-way street.
Right.
Yes.
Did you see any evidence of such a signal code or understanding between the mayor and the acting general manager in these meetings? No. Do you think it would have been useful if there had been such a pre-planned relationship, I so that they could deal with it?
My recollection is we spoke about that in my meeting with the two of them.
And what is the effect, in your view, on a meeting where there isn't such a streamlined working relationship and there is an element of...
Well, you run the risk of error if the chair, regardless of who, whichever meeting we're talking about, if the chair is not aware of the legal requirement or whatever, then you run the risk of error. And you also run the risk of procedural disruption. My observation of Wingecarribee Council was that a couple of the councillors were very well versed in local government procedure, and perhaps more so than the mayor was my observation, and that did give rise to discussion about the mayor's chairing of the meeting at times.
I might raise an issue with you now. Each councillor has the ability, if they see an active disorder, to make a point of order. That's pretty standard meeting practice, and as I understand it, it's in the Code of Meeting Practice itself. Is there an obligation, in your view, on a councillor who observes an active disorder to do something about it, or are they perfectly within their rights to sit there and say, in their own mind at least, that's the mayor's problem or the chair's problem?
Anyone is entitled to raise a point of order at any stage. The function of the chair then is to rule on the point of order. Then the meeting can debate whether they agree or wish to dissent from the mayor's opinion in this case. So that's, in my view, that's the proper process. I'm not. I don't think it's incumbent if a councillor considers something might have been incorrectly done, for example. My own view would be that it's not incumbent on them to raise a point of order. They may wish to do so, and then it gets ruled on and dealt with under the proper process. My own view, it's not incumbent on them to raise that point.
I suppose there might be a scale, Mr. Reynolds, where minor matters that could potentially be a point of order can just be let through to the keeper. Part of, I think, Mr. Parrish's question is driving at an issue of, if there are acts of disorder that destabilise a meeting, should it just be left to the mayor to try and deal with them from the chair, or should the councillors who are there participating in a meeting that might be thought to be going off the rails, taking points in support of the mayor?
Yeah, sorry to overstep.
Sorry, no, you're quite right.
In those sort of circumstances, I would say that is not the sort of minor thing that I would pass over if I was a councillor.
Yes.
I think it's, again, it gets back to the cooperative running of the meeting. Yes, the mayor's the chair, but he or she is not. They're not an island. They exist in the context of the meeting.
Yes.
And other councillors are perfectly within their right to raise a point of order like that.
Yes.
I would think so.
Yes, thank you.
And the first obligation under section 232, subsection 1 of the Local Government Act, and I might show it to you.
That would be excellent.
Mr.
That
Board
would be excellent.
Scramble. I'll read it out and then let you digest it.
Do you want mine, Mr. Parrish?
Mr. Broad has
He's found
saved the day.
I haven't yet committed the Local Government Act to memory, I'm sorry.
I don't think anyone has.
No.
Not a touch screen, so you need to.
Yep.
I think you were just answering a question from the Commissioner and circumstances where we're not just talking about run-of-the-mill disagreements or grumblings, but there's a danger that the meeting might run off the rails or there be serious inefficiencies. In respect of section 232, subparagraph 1, subparagraph A, the role of the councillor is to be an active and contributing member of the governing body. And I appreciate you're not a lawyer and require statutory interpretation, but you are a man of immense experience. In your opinion, is part of that role set out in 1A to ensure that the meeting is not completely run off the rails using the tools available to councillors observing the meeting?
I suppose the answer is yes. If I'm a councillor, one way I might think of contributing is to raise points of order if I think something has gone awry. So that is, that I guess that would come under that heading.
Is it fair to say from your answer to the Commissioner before that it is a matter of degree though?
Well, I think so.
Yes.
Yes, but in the sort of circumstance the Commissioner was raising, if the disorder is sufficiently marked like that, then it needs to be dealt with one way or another.
Yes.
To avoid the whole meeting being derailed.
Do I sense the cautiousness in your answer to guard against the prospect that minor procedural matters which have no impact on the business of the meeting shouldn't be bogged down in points of order for the sake of points of order? Is that?
Well, I think, yes, I suppose that's in summary. I mean, when I was at Blacktown, I don't know, I went to council meetings for 15 years, I suppose, and every now and again a councillor would interject and another councillor would raise a point of order and the mayor would deal with it, just
Yes.
saying, well, look, it's not a point of order, but you just, behave yourself.
Yes.
So it's dealt with on the run rather than via a formal process. When you're getting to formal issues, it's significant disagreement, then you need to deal with it procedurally correctly and have it dealt with.
Yes. Thank you. I understand.
Your next observation was that on occasion a motion needed to be quotation wordsmithed quotations during the meeting, and the Mayor became involved in this process on occasion, which compromised his ability to chair the meeting at those stages. Can you explain firstly what wordsmithed means?
Yes, I should be more correct when I write things, shouldn't I?
No.
I observed on a number of occasions where there was debate around an issue that there was probably what you would call a general understanding of where the council wanted to go with a resolution, but it wasn't as per the business paper which had been presented by the staff. So there was a very loose process then of rewriting the thing on the run so that they would vote on a thing. On occasion, the mayor got involved in trying to figure out the wording, what it would be. And whilst that's happening, and again, we're in the context of an online meeting, so there are 6 or 7 councillors not in the room, somewhere else, and the mayor is working on a thing with the AGM or a staff member. It's just a very, it just acts to undermine the due process of the meeting. In my view and in my advice to them was that if they held briefings on these issues with the staff beforehand, they might actually come to a view on what the council might move on this matter. And there'd be a chance to actually craft a substitute resolution that one of the councillors could have moved, rather than doing it in the meeting. In the extreme, if you get to a stage where something does have to be done in the meeting, probably better to call a short adjournment and have the staff work on the wording and call the meeting back to order and present the new wording rather than trying to do it in the middle of a debate on items, in my view.
Your next observation, I think we've already dealt with, that the Mayor responded to procedural questions and issues where it may have been more appropriate for the matter to have been referred to the Acting General Manager.
Yes, we have alluded to that. And my approach to those sorts of circumstances as GM would be to indicate to the Mayor that I'll take this question, because I wouldn't necessarily assume that the Mayor is across the relevant procedure or whatever. Better for a staff member to answer that sort of detailed question, I think. But it does, again, as we've alluded to before, it relies on an interplay between the Mayor and the GM to manage those circumstances.
And your last observation of those first 3 meetings was that on one occasion, a suggestion arose from the floor which appeared to contravene policy. The Mayor and the staff attempted to deal with the matter during the meeting, where it may have been preferable to call for a report on ways of achieving an outcome rather than conceding on the spot, which encourages that sort of activity in the future. Can you explain the procedure or the preferable procedure for going away and calling for a report to deal with it that way?
Sitting here today, I'm actually struggling to remember the circumstance, the details of that circumstance.
If you don't remember the specific circumstance, we can at least deal with it at a high level.
In principle, yes.
Yes.
Where that's the case, my method of working and where I've in an experience in the past, if you get to a stage like that, rather than trying to resolve quite competing different points of view as part of a discussion stroke debate in the council, it is actually better to call for a report on that matter. So my experience, the Mayor might ask for a motion from a councillor to seek a report, and then that gets voted on. If it's passed, then the matter passes on, and it can come back to the council in a considered fashion with both sides of an argument, if there were such, dealt with in the form of a considered report, rather than trying to resolve potentially contentious issues in the floor of a meeting as part of it's not actually I don't think it's envisaged in the Code of Meeting Practice. It's just it very much interferes with the flow of the meeting and doesn't help a good outcome. Also, because you're my observation at the time, I remember, was, well, by the way it was dealt with, it encouraged the particular councillor to, if they wished to disrupt proceedings, to try that again, because there was experience in how that was going to be managed, which wasn't particularly helpful to an outcome for the whole meeting.
Thank you. Now, after those first 3 meetings, you held coaching sessions, is that correct?
Yes, I had a detailed meeting with the Mayor and the Acting General Manager.
Commissioner, I don't intend to ask questions about that. It doesn't really go within any term of reference, and as I understand it, there may be confidentiality attached to those meetings, and I just don't think it's necessary to traverse those areas unless you have a different view.
Without going into the detail of what I understand from Mr. Parrish's proposition were confidential discussions, and tell me if this would impugn that confidentiality, do the observations, I withdraw that, can you describe the general topics that were the subject of those coaching discussions, or does that cause some difficulty with confidentiality?
No, I don't think so.
Right. So I think just some general topics might at least put some parameters around what they were about, without going into the detail of who said what about what.
Yes. Look, we spoke at some length about the role of the Mayor as chair versus a participant in the, if you know, in debate. We spoke about that. We spoke about things I've mentioned before, process issues like vacating the chair if you wish to speak, working relationship between the GM and the Mayor, briefings before the meeting on issues, being confident enough to, defer items, calling for reports, that sort of thing. So the things I've been talking about before, we spoke about. There were issues we spoke about as well in terms of if I call it the demeanour of the council, in terms of respect for the chair. And there may well have been personal issues which I didn't delve into, but the mayor is chair of the meeting and needs to be shown due respect in that position. And respect for each other as elected representatives, albeit with different views. Also a need to show respect for staff and vice versa. We spoke of those sorts of issues. I talked about process stuff like using the en bloc motion and issues like that. That was on the afternoon prior to a council meeting that night. And at that meeting, the practices and the changes we spoke about were carried out. And the mayor's parting words to me after, because I was in attendance for that meeting, the mayor's parting words was, "That's the best meeting we've had." And I think I might have said, "See, it can be done," or words to that effect. So it was generally, the discussion was generally around those sorts of issues that we've spoken about before and how they might be better managed on the floor of council, and prior to the council meeting, some of the issues need to be dealt with outside the meeting, not in the meeting itself. And it seemed to be, the other contextual thing there was the councillors, was my understanding, had already not long before, undertaken some mediation training with Mr. Turkington, who was employed under the Performance Improvement Order as well. So it may well be that some of the training had some results in that respect as well, I suspect.
Yes, thank you. Yes, Mr. Parrish.
Can I take you to page 222 of the tender bundle? Those are the process improvements identified 28 October 2020. Do you see
That's
that?
correct, yes.
Are they broadly the improvements and the
Yes.
matters you identified and you've just spoke about?
That's right, yes.
Can I ask you about number 6? It says,
I'm sorry, before we move on, just so I understand that answer, does attachment 3 effectively repeat the summary that I just asked you for about the improvements that were discussed?
Effectively, yes.
So that's different to your observations of that meeting, which are dealt with back on page 220. Have I understood that correctly?
The observations were at the bottom of page 220.
Yes.
Were my observations of the council meeting held that night,
Yeah, okay, thank you.
after we had that session.
Yes, sorry to interrupt, I understand.
thank you, Commissioner. Number 6 there, you observe or identify, council should conduct briefings on matters on the business papers prior to the meeting. In this way, issues can be clarified where necessary and the question/answer component would be removed from the agenda. This would avoid council staff potentially being the focus of debate and avoid politicking as part of the question/answer session. This would save time in the formal meeting and enable the business to move straight to the putting of a motion and debate on the motion, avoiding confusion over the mover/secondary identities and rights. As I understood it, there were briefing sessions prior to the meetings, at least on the day of the meeting. Can you explain what you mean by, I think, the content, perhaps, of the briefings?
Yes, what I observed in the council meetings where these issues happened, and significantly around development issues, is my recollection, planning issues, the matter would come up for debate. Just as a general sequence, matter would come up for debate. There may well be speakers from the public brought in speaking for and against. Then a council staff member might be asked to step forward and explain effectively what's in the report, which is a public document anyway. But they were there and were then able to be questioned by councillors about issues in the report. To my mind, I was going to use the word embroiled. I'm not sure if that's too strong, but they became a participant, either not by their own volition, in the actual to and fro on the debates around an issue. In my experience, if there are briefings, I mean, some councils do have them, some don't. A council like this, I think, they apparently did have briefings, but what the content was and how the result was, I wasn't privy to. But my view, in a council setting, the councillors are there, the mayor's chairing, the general manager's there, and usually there are senior officers. In this case, it would be Mr. Pepping, the Deputy General Manager, and one or two others, I suspect. My experience of an efficiently run meeting is that questions are directed through the chair to one of the senior officers of council about the report, rather than getting into the nitty-gritty with an author. This process was not helped by councillors being able to, as part of their question and answer or whatever process, alluding to the fact that they were going to move something. Then that became in their mind, I have moved. And the mayor, I think correctly in this regard, there had not been a motion moved at all. So when he then subsequently called for a motion and a mover and seconder, that led to further issues. So it was just a very, it was a stage in the meeting that was trying to do too many things rather than deal with the issue and debate the issue. If there were questions if the report was deficient in terms of information, then in my view the correct process would be to defer the matter and call for further information on issue X, whatever that issue is, and have it debated fully later, rather than trying to discern facts in the middle of a debate.
And do I take it from that answer that if the staff were reporting on, for instance, DA issues at briefings beforehand, and there was an amount of nitty-gritty in the briefing beforehand, that for that to come up at council meeting as well was an unnecessary duplication, perhaps, of a process?
Well, I think so, yes.
Thank you.
Not that I was privy to those earlier briefings,
No.
but if there was a duplication, then yes.
Did you gain any impression from the council meetings about whether briefings if held were sufficient and fit for purpose?
The prior briefings.
Yes.
The role of the council officers, my recollection is that when they were asked to speak, they were generally just providing a précis of what the report said anyway. So I didn't actually see that it added too much information to the meeting that wasn't already there. I would have thought that those sorts of issues ought to have been dealt with in prior briefings if there were to be dealt with there.
And do I take it from that answer that the procedure you observed in council meetings surrounding this was not efficient or effective?
Neither of those.
So can I go back a couple of pages to get your observations from the meeting held after the 28 October coaching sessions? That's at the bottom of page 220
Yes.
of the 1000. Your first observation was that the participants generally exhibited an improved regard to meeting process immediately following the training pursuant to Mr. Turkington's engagement. I think that's the mediation and other
Yes.
matters that Mr. Turkington
Yes.
was dealing with. However, there was some passive-aggressive behaviour still evidenced by some councillors, and civility declined over the second tranche of meetings observed. Can you give us an example or your recollections of that behaviour, if you can remember?
Yes, so my meeting with the Mayor and the Acting General Manager about process improvements was on the 28th of October. Subsequently, they had a meeting that night, which was the one that the Mayor observed had gone really well, in his view. I subsequently sat through another 2 or 3 council meetings, and my observation was that the sort of behaviours declined from that high point, if you like to call the 28th the high point. And some of the civility declined over those remaining meetings. When I used the term passive-aggressive, what I was referring to was the calling of points of order around process when, as I mentioned before, a couple of the councillors were very proficient in council process and procedure. But when they called a point of order, it wasn't in what I would call a constructive, this is my observation anyway, it didn't appear to be a constructive calling of a point of order. It was more a point of scoring.
That first meeting, was the improvement in your impression caused by the more assertive, effective chairing of the meeting by the Mayor, or a conscious effort on behalf of the newly mediated councillors to behave better, or a bit of both?
Look, we've mentioned before, these council meetings, they're a cooperative effort, and my observation was that across the board, there was a better feeling in the meeting. The Mayor was certainly more assertive in chairing. One of the benefits, I suppose, of being online was if there was a bit of a banter going on, then the Mayor actually had a mute button which he used, and that pretty much called people to order once they all realised they'd been muted. So you can't do that in a physical meeting,
No.
but so it's one of the benefits of online. So he chaired that, in my view. That was the best meeting that I saw chaired. The councillors as a whole were more cooperative and contributory. In fact, I made a note, I can't remember if I put it in my report, but I made a note to myself that there was actually, for the only time in my period of observation, there was actually what I would call friendly banter between the councillors before the live meeting started. Everyone's online until it's clicked on. So there was a bit of friendly flow of just chat between the councillors, which I hadn't observed before, and to my recollection didn't observe again. So the meeting on the 28th was the high point, I think, in terms of process and cooperation. And
then the 2 subsequent meetings that you observed, there was a wearing off of the goodwill?
A slow decline, yes,
slow decline.
My observation.
So a family Christmas dinner or something? Just
I finished before Christmas, so I can't comment on a Christmas dinner. Although mine was very satisfactory at home, thank you.
Oh, good. The reference to the muting of councillors in the Zoom or the Teams or the online context, was that appropriate in your context? Or was that an appropriate tool to use in your context?
I think in the online context, yes. I felt for the council, and I felt for the Mayor in the circumstance of having to meet online.
Yes.
Whatever the circumstances were with the councillors and their views of each other, the actual technological requirement to meet online didn't help engender a good outcome, in my view. Partly the reason for my recommendation that once this chamber was functional, that the council ought to be let run for, particularly under observation granted, but to see if the improved behaviour actually manifested itself once they got back in chambers. I did mention at the outset that one of the additional things I did was, I think I spoke to 6 out of the 8 councillors. 2 didn't avail themselves of the opportunity, but 6 did. One of them in particular commented that he was of the view and hopeful that when they got back meeting in person, that things would improve. And that was part of my thinking behind my recommendation.
that observation may not engender a lot of sympathy with the rest of the population who spent 2 years having meetings online. Do you think that the councillors had an obligation to try harder, be more patient in
Look,
that
I think,
online context? I appreciate you're not making excuses for them, you're observing.
No, I'm observing. I think, given the requirements of a council, as as we've observed in the Act, it's incumbent on the councillors and the staff to work within the parameters that they've got to be as civil and as cooperative as possible. The online environment was difficult, but not impossible if people had been of goodwill and cooperative. But I did think that meeting in person might make a difference, potentially.
I'm sorry, tell me if you're unable to express a view about this, but the difficulties that might have been experienced in the online environment, were they a legacy of the difficulties that were already existing and perhaps amplified by having to move online?
I would say amplified.
Yes.
Yes. There were, I alluded to it before as well, there were technical issues from time to time which certainly didn't help at all. But I think there were, the online environment served to provide a platform, if that's the right word, for previous behaviours to be more manifest, I think.
Thank you.
I think over the page, your observations 3, 4 and 5 we've discussed in various ways.
Yes.
Unless you want to make any further
No.
observations. In respect of your observations from subsequent individual discussions, and again, if anything to your mind is confidential and ought not be exposed, please let us know. But I think you've dealt with number 1, that the return to a physical meeting will facilitate an improvement in the conduct of the meetings.
Yes.
I might skip over number 2 because I think that might be an issue that we all have. In respect of the third one, there appears to be an intractable interpersonal conflict between several councillors which impacts both council meeting process and relations between some councillors and council staff. Ongoing counselling for councillors, including the mayor, such as the EAP program, may be desirable to manage the circumstances on an ongoing basis. Can you tell me about how you came to that impression, without having to detail individual conversations that you had? But
Yes, look, my general impression across the time I was there was that there appeared to be significant levels of distrust between two groups of councillors, 4 on one side, inverted commas side, 3 on the other, with one a floater. Not helped by the fact, I suppose, there were 9 councillors before, and the extension of the council term, I understand, had led to one councillor resigning, which left 8, and quite often an even split of voting. So that my observation was that there appeared to be a level of distrust between the two groups of councillors. There appeared to be a level of distrust between some of the councillors and the staff, the senior staff. And my observation was that apparent level of distrust was also expressed by the staff of that group of councillors. So there appeared to me to be a bit of a disjoint between some of the councillors and staff and vice versa, and certainly between the two groups of councillors. So, and that, whilst there'd been mediation training and I'd commented on process improvements for them, neither of those initiatives, if I can use that word, appeared likely to address that underlying level of distrust.
And appreciating that that is not necessarily a problem caused by the chair of a meeting, how can a chair of a meeting deal with those sorts of circumstances, in your opinion?
Well, I think the chair of the meeting is, it's an important role, but it's several hours out of a week. I mean, those sort of interpersonal relationships grow over time with continuing interaction, not just in the council meeting. The council meeting is a public manifestation of things, but the rest of the year goes on not in a public forum. So those sorts of ongoing relationship issues need to be dealt with and growing over time.
And just to tie that to your very first observation in your report this morning, does clarity around process help to reduce the prospect that interpersonal conflicts might derail, disrupt or cause problems in a meeting?
Yes, I think so.
Commissioner, I was going to move on from specific topics in that report.
Yes, just on meeting procedure generally, I appreciate your observations earlier that one may not expect a mayor or any councillor to be an expert on meeting procedure and the intricacies of finer points. But do you think that it's incumbent on any councillor to familiarise themselves, at least to a solid working degree, with meeting procedure?
Look, that would be helpful, but I think in practice, expecting councillors to do that off their own bat is not reasonable.
Well, that's my next question.
I would be thinking that, let us say, with the election of a new council, then there ought to be some reasonably specific training.
Yes.
Which is a cooperative effort between the staff and the councillors, the new councillors, on meeting procedure and the code of meeting practice, that sort of thing. Whether that had happened at Wingecarribee in the life of this council, I don't know.
Yes.
But I would have thought, yes, training, but that ought to be initiated by the administration,
Yes.
calling councillors together and giving that. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, I was interrupting
giving
you.
that training as a group rather than individually, because they're going to need to work together as a group. So they need to be able to see each other, asking questions, and clarifying issues.
Yes.
So I would think that's the best approach.
If one assumes that training of that kind is given in the induction process, then what I'm trying to explore with you is councillors are participants in a meeting that's covered by a set of procedures.
Correct.
And tell me if you disagree with the proposition, but there must be some requirement of those who are participating in the meeting that's governed by such procedures, which feed into a code of conduct, which feed into an act, to have some knowledge and appreciation of them. Do you disagree with that?
I'd agree with you, but how that works in practice would be, I think, education sessions.
Yes.
Facilitated by the staff.
That there may be a need to provide councillors with tools, or better tools perhaps, to achieve that, but yes, as a fundamental premise, you don't disagree?
No, I don't disagree. And I think, those sorts of things, councils, except in, I was going to say extraordinary circumstances, but we've had fairly extraordinary circumstance in local government for the last 10 years in New South Wales. Councillors come in every 4 years. Probably not sufficient to have one session, in week one.
Yes. When
councillors may well be experiencing being a councillor for the first time and not in practice. So my preferred position would be to certainly have those education sessions early, and then perhaps review them at a time agreed with the councillors.
Yes.
So that they can just reflect on how things have gone in practice, and they might actually then observe, well, paragraph 3 of the Code of Conduct is actually problematic for us, and they might come up with a different way of operating.
It's almost a continuing professional development program for councillors.
Yes.
What about mayors and deputy mayors? Do you think that there's a need for particular or additional training around chairing a meeting?
I think that would be a very good idea. I mean, people who chair meetings for a living or, as part of their normal job, but if you're coming into it without that experience, I think specific training around the chairing, the role of a chair versus, inverted commas, an ordinary councillor. I suppose they were the sorts of things I was talking to the mayor about during the process.
And in that context, does a mayor or a deputy mayor require a greater level of understanding and knowledge of meeting procedure, even if not to the extent of being an expert in its finer points?
Look, I think that would be helpful.
Yes.
And probably if there is, not all councils have a deputy mayor, but those that do, both the mayor and the deputy ought to be across those generalities in case the deputy is called on to chair.
And from your observations of meetings at this council, do you have a view about whether at a base level the councillors had an adequate understanding and working knowledge of the code of meeting practice?
I suspect some did, but I could only judge on observation.
Yes.
And perhaps not in observation of in practice.
Yes. And what about the mayor? Did you be able to form a view about, from your observations, his level of knowledge and appreciation of the code of meeting practice?
He would not have been the most experienced person in the room in terms of meeting practice and codes of conduct.
Yes. Was it an adequate level of knowledge in your view? Or did he display an adequate level of knowledge? I appreciate you're not able to get inside his head, but
No.
from what you saw...
No, not really.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Parrish?
Excuse me.
Mr. Parrish, should I just adjourn for
That-
10 minutes?
Yes, that would be quite useful at this stage.
Yes, Mr. Reynolds, I'm just going to take the mid-morning break for 10 minutes to allow us all to stretch our legs, and we'll resume at 25 past.
Thank you.
Yes. Yes, Mr Parish.
Thank you, Mr Reynolds. At this time, I'm going to take advantage of your significant experience and ask a few questions that hopefully will enlighten me, the Commissioner, and any poor soul watching. Can you explain, generally speaking, what the rules of debate are, the process around that?
Well, how long have we got? Look, rules of debate.
Just the general
Yeah,
process.
look, so the chair is the chair. They will call for a motion. In the context of a council meeting, a councillor will move something. The mayor will ask for a seconder. If there's no seconder, the motion lapses. If there is a seconder, the motion is moved. Then the mayor would call for speakers. So the mover and the seconder would speak. And depending on where you're at, there's a time limit on, set for how long people can speak for. And then generally there would be speakers for and against in sequence, depending on how many wish to speak. At any point in time, someone can call for the motion to be put, and then that motion has to be debated on the spot. If that gets up, then the motion is put. If you proceed through to the end of debate, the mayor would then give the mover the right of reply, and then the motion would be voted on in general terms.
Yes, thank you. Can you explain how the amendment process may work if there is a motion for amendment within that?
You can have someone foreshadow an amendment, and that would then come up if the motion is lost. If an amendment is moved and seconded, then the amendment is voted on first. And then if the amendment gets up, that becomes the motion and is then voted on as the motion. If the amendment lapses or is lost, then the debate returns to the original motion.
Thank you.
So that the procedure tries to be really cut and dried with a fairness and transparency in the debate.
Yes, thank you. Can you explain what questions on or with notice are?
Questions, excuse me, questions with notice, or there are questions without notice.
I'll come to those in a second.
Okay. Well, questions with notice.
Questions with notice first.
Generally speaking, councils will have a process where a councillor can lodge a notice of motion or a question prior to the meeting. There's generally a time limit, so that it doesn't happen on the day, so that the administration can include it in the business of the meeting. Some councils may put rules around that, like it might have to be more than one councillor. I'm not sure can't recall what the process was here. Those questions with notice then go on the business paper, and they can be, sometimes there are notices of motion as well, where a councillor might want something to go on the business paper, which would then get dealt with as a motion.
And
so the key with the question with notice is that it's known beforehand.
And it seems obvious when you put it that way, but can you explain what a question without notice is? Same thing.
Yes, that's right. Well, it's a question. In my experience, and particularly given my experience at Blacktown, it's generally to be expected that there will be questions without notice. Things that have arisen on the day of the meeting, a constituent has contacted a councillor, wants information, or there's a footpath needs to be fixed, whatever. At Blacktown, we used to have a specific part of the meeting which was allocated to questions without notice, and the mayor would go around the room, and each councillor, my recollection is, had the ability to ask 2 questions without notice. So we had 15 councillors, so at the maximum there'd be 30 questions without notice. That'd either be questions to staff about an issue, in which case they go to the general manager, and I as the general manager would either answer or defer to the planner or the engineer. Or if sometimes they were more in the light of a motion requesting work to be done, and they were dealt with as urgent matters. So the process we used was to recognise that, yes, questions without notice are right and proper, and there is a portion of the meeting specifically allocated to those. So it sort of corrals that process from the rest of the debate in the meeting, which we found quite efficient.
Yes. Do you have an impression of how questions without notice were dealt with in the Shire Council meetings that you observed in this?
There were my recollection is there were a number of notices of motion and questions on notice. My recollection again is that some of those might have been dealt with before, quite exhaustively, but came up again, so that the debate would be revisited with the same outcome, which is not particularly helpful. Beyond that, I'm thinking a lot of the questioning actually occurred as part of the debate on a particular report, like a development matter. So the questions would be asked backwards and forwards there, rather than confining that discussion to a debate process.
Is that an appropriate procedure in your view?
I don't think it's very efficient, and not one that I would favour.
Is there a particular reason why you wouldn't favour it?
Well, again, getting back to maybe my preference, I think the time for questioning and debate and exploring in detail issues about a matter is in a briefing outside the debating process.
And can it also lead to confusion about what part of the meeting we're in and what we're doing?
There was certainly did give rise to confusion in the meetings I observed, yes.
Yes. Thank you.
Did you witness any rescission motions being moved upon in the meetings you observed?
Look, I can't recall. I may have, I just can't recall, I'm sorry.
Can you explain what a rescission motion is?
Yes, a rescission motion is where a motion has been passed by the council. Councillors are entitled to lodge what's called a rescission motion, which is effectively to negate that resolution, and normally it's associated with a notice of motion that says, get rid of that one and we move this. There's a time limit on when they have to be lodged. Some can be lodged at the meeting. Some councils have a process where it can be a couple of days after the meeting. So yes, basically it's to negate what's been moved and substitute an alternate motion, which then gets dealt with as part of the business paper the next time round. Although my recollection is, if it's lodged in the meeting, I stand corrected, but I think you can debate the rescission motion at that meeting and have the matter dealt with.
Thank you. Can you explain what the Committee of the Whole is?
Committee of the Whole is the council would move a motion to adjourn to Committee of the Whole, which is effectively confidential. It's normally, there are provisions under the Act where certain matters are confidential, like property issues or staff or things like that, which are dealt with in private, in closed session. And normally when the matter has been dealt with in the closed session, it goes back to the open meeting of council, and a report is made of the decision made in the Committee of the Whole.
Thank you. I'm going to show you a couple of documents now. These are just examples of certain procedures that have been undertaken by this council that would be interested in your opinion on. The first document you should have is an email from Duncan Gare, which says, subject re objecting to spending funds on bypass and barrel.
I see that.
You see that? And you see there is an email about 2/3 of the way down, in which Duncan.Gear at wsc.nsw.gov.au is writing to Ms. Armstrong.
Yes, I see that.
It's slightly indented.
Yes, I see that.
Can I start by asking, clearly you're going to be familiar with the distinction between operational and strategic, that dichotomy often used in the local government space between the role of the governing body and the role of the GM and the staff.
Yes.
And the strategic is the provenance and domain of the governing body, and the operational is the provenance and domain of the GM and the staff. Is that about right?
Yes, there's a difference between strategic and operational issues. Generally, the Act is structured around the policy, the elected council being the policy-making body and the staff being the administration body, in general terms.
Yes. Can I take you to the motion that's referred to in this email, motion 392/19, moved by Deputy Mayor Turland and seconded by Councillor Halstead, that council staff commence the cleaning up and removal of the regrowth and overgrown weeds and rubbish in the drain from Barrel Street and the northern council car park. My question's broken up into a few parts, I guess. Firstly, A, whether you see this as strategic or operational. B, whether this is the sort of thing that ought to be dealt with at all by the governing body, and C, whether it's something that, in your experience, would be appropriately dealt with by a motion like this.
Can you give me A again? I'll deal with them in sequence.
Testing
My
memory.
Yes, perhaps break them up.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Is the subject matter of this motion something you would regard as operational or strategic?
I would regard it as generally operational.
Number two, is that the sort of matter that you would expect the governing body would involve themselves with?
My normal experience of that would be that if an issue like that had arisen, it would be dealt with not as part of a council meeting, it would be dealt with as part of, inverted commas, correspondence between the council laws and the staff. No, for example, if that was a resident issue, that a resident had contacted either of these councillors and drawn attention to the issue, in my experience, the normal sort of daily way of operating would be that a councillor would ring me as the GM and say, look, I've got a problem reported to me about X. Can you have a look at it? Just a general thing to include in the normal operation of council, and not normal that that would come up, in my experience, in a council meeting. Not to say that, when I mentioned before questions without notice at my previous council, if there was an urgent matter that was significant, then they could ask a question about an issue like that.
Yes.
But it would be dealt with, rather than a motion to direct council staff to do a particular thing. They would ask a question about, can something happen? And in this case, in our case, for this sort of issue, it would have been the engineering director will say, I'll take that on notice and get onto it tomorrow, something like that. So in the general run of things.
Just before Mr. Parrish asks his next question, in that last answer, you used the words, direct council staff. That's a matter solely within the purview of the general manager,
That's
is it
correct.
not?
That's correct.
And would you agree or disagree with the proposition that it's not a matter that is appropriate to be done by a governing body through a resolution like this?
I think I'd agree with that proposition in this case, yes.
And the fact that the governing body did so Well, I withdraw that. I can't tell from this document whether the motion was passed. It seems to have been from the context of the email, but let's just assume for the moment that it was, and that can be checked in the documents. But assume that the document, that this was passed, does that inform one's understanding of how the councillors saw their role? Or is that too general a question for you?
Look, it's a bit hard sitting here now to comment on that. It may have been that councillors felt the only way they could get action on something was to raise it in council. It may have been that sort of circumstance.
Yes,
I'm not
I
sure.
understand.
I don't know.
I understand, yes. Thank you. Mr Parrish.
I think Mr Reynolds answered the third question there about whether it would be an appropriate way to do it. I might just put that document aside for now and mark the second document that I'm going to refer to as well, if that's appropriate, as a bundle, or I can do it separately.
Perhaps do it separately,
Okay.
so that if we come back to it. So you just want me to mark this for the moment?
Yes, please.
Yes, all right. The document referred to in Mr Reynolds' evidence, which includes an email from Duncan Gare of 7 May 2020 at 10:43am referring to motion M9392/19 will be MFI 4.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Mr Broad, I'll just return the MFI to you for the moment. Yes, you proceed, Mr Parrish.
Mr Reynolds, the second document you may have there is a notice of business, notice of motion form,
Yes,
and that's dated 26 February 2020, just under the notice of motion.
that's right. Yes, it is.
Can you just take your time and read the proposed resolutions?
I've read the motion.
Thank you. And just for the transcript, I'll read them out. The first motion, Prayer 1, or proposed recommendation 1, is that the Mayor explain in detail how he believes he had the power at the EGM 29 January 2020 to refuse to accept my motion to suspend standing orders to allow members of the public to address council or ask questions, and prayer or resolution 2, the Mayor detail that power with the relevant extracts and references from our Code of Meeting Practice and the Local Government Act, and advise how the statement, quotations, it is not permitted, close quotations, accords with the policy. Number 3, that the Mayor advise how his ruling accords with, quotations, our mission, comma, our vision, comma, our values, comma, close quotations, statement that appears in every agenda paper, below, in square brackets. Number 4, that the Mayor advise why his second refusal of my motion, brackets, quotations, it is disallowed, close brackets, close quotations, did not appear in the draft minutes, question mark. Can I get your impressions of that, both in respect of whether this is an appropriate way to deal with it at a procedural level, and whether the issues raised within it are appropriate to be dealt with in this way?
I'd firstly comment that I don't think I've seen something like that elsewhere before,
Okay.
and before today. I would have thought if a councillor is dissatisfied with an outcome of a process, regardless of who was right or wrong at the time, There are abilities to refer matters elsewhere. For example, Office of Local Government, Ombudsman, in extreme circumstances, ICAC. In fact, there's responsibilities in terms of ICACable, inverted commas, issues. I would have thought they might have been a more appropriate process than what's set out here. One of those, perhaps in first instance, OLG, perhaps.
One way to read the proposed prayers in this notice of motion is that it seeks to cavil with a previous decision made of the chair.
It does appear
by
so.
use of the notice of motion process.
Yes, it
Do you
does
think
appear
that's
so.
appropriate in any circumstance?
Well, I think whatever the issue was at the council, I presume it was dealt with at the council. And if there was dissent from the mayor's ruling at the time, ought to have been debated at the time as a motion of dissent from the chair's ruling, and the matter dealt with and put to bed then, rather than raised again.
So the appropriate procedure, if there was any dissatisfaction, would have been a dissent motion at the time that the ruling was made.
That's my view.
Thank you. Could I get that document also marked for identification?
Yes. Before I do that, Mr. Reynolds, is the concept of suspension of standing orders something that arises out of the Code of Meeting Practice?
Oh, look, I can't recall the specifics.
That's right.
It's not suspension of standing orders is not it's not abnormal in local government practice. Normally, for example, if I use Blacktown as an example, standing orders might be suspended to bring a matter forward in the debate process rather than leave it to later in the debate, particularly if there are members of the public who are interested in the outcome of an item.
Yes.
So for those sorts of circumstances, a suspension of standing orders was quite routine practice in inverted commas. So I'm presuming, and I just can't recall, I'm presuming the code of practice here would allow for suspension. I suppose so.
That's right. My question was perhaps badly framed, and you've answered it in the appropriate way. That is it something that happens?
It does.
I think you've answered that. Yes, the notice of motion dated 17 February 2020, to which Mr. Reynolds was taken to by council assisting, will be MFI 5. Mr. Broad, I'll just return that to you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Yes, Mr. Parish.
Commissioner, I don't have any further questions at this stage.
Yes, all right. Are there any applications? No? Mr. Reynolds, that completes your evidence. Thank you for your attendance this morning. You're excused from further attendance under your summons and free to go on your way.
Find my umbrella.
Yes, it looks like you may need it.
Thank you.
Mr. Parish, your next witness is Mr. Clark.
That's correct, Mr. Jim Clark.
Do you just, given that Mr. Clark has been reorganised, do you need a short time to get yourself organised, or are you ready to go?
Ready to go, Commissioner.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Clark, come forward, please. It's not Mr. Clark.
Mr. Clark, excuse me, quite to give your evidence either by virtue of an oath or an affirmation, which would you affirm?
Affirmation.
You affirm that the evidence you're about to give to this inquiry will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I do.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. Have a seat. Mr. Parish.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. Can I start with your personal and vocational background and your connection with the Shire?
Yeah. Okay, just to raise that I have a hearing issue that's arisen recently, so you may need to speak up a little bit.
Of course, and let us know if you can't understand any question.
Okay, so I've lived in Bundanoon. I've been a resident in the Shire for 32 years. My profession was telecommunications technical officer, specialising in exchange installation and optical fibre. I had a redundancy from Telstra in 2002 after 30 years, and after that I worked part-time for Australia Post, and I did quite a bit of bush care volunteer work for council. I am a member of the Greens. I was a candidate for the state seat of Southern Highlands in 1999 and 2003. I was elected as a Green for Wingecarribee Council in 2004. I served 3 terms on council and was re-elected in 2008 and 2012. And also, incidentally, I was a Greens candidate for Hume in 2007 federal election. So I stood down in 2016 council election, and Gordon Markwhite was my replacement candidate who was elected for the Greens. I chaired the Heritage Committee from 2008 to 2016. I also co-chaired the Environment Committee in 2004 to 2016. And I felt both of these committees were very productive for council. Also, in finishing, I was the General Manager's nominee on the GM's Performance Review Committee for most of that time for a couple of General Managers.
Thank you. And bearing in mind that you weren't a councillor in the 2016-2020 term, did you have occasion to see meetings or experience the conduct and behaviour of councillors in that 2016 to 2020 period?
So in that later term, I didn't have a great deal of overview of council matters. I hadn't actually attended a meeting. I only attended one meeting to get a service award after I left council. But I did keep in touch with my following councillor, Gordon Markwhite, and obviously the media, and I did get an impression that things weren't great.
Can I start by asking about your experience on the previous councils where you were a councillor?
Yeah.
There has been some evidence that there was a culture in previous councils that in some ways just followed through to the present suspended council. Do you have a view on that or an impression?
Yeah, a number of the councillors were returned, and I think that my last council term, up to the election of the new council, was also had some troubling features in it, yes.
Can you tell me specifically from your recollection what some of those troubling features were?
I think there were several councillors who were hard to deal with in council meetings, and also the senior staff had a lot of problems in dealing with some of those councillors.
Do I take it from that answer that in your experience there was a troubling relationship between senior staff and some councillors in that 2012-2016?
Some of the councillors, yes, yeah.
Do you have a view about what the cause of that problematic relationship was?
Well, there were a couple of councillors elected on that term who were fairly strong-minded people who took the view that their opinions were going to be heard in a forthright manner, and sometimes that disrupted the meetings.
Do I take it from that answer that from time to time there were disruptions caused by the way councillors interacted with or treated staff who were at that meeting?
Yes, it had degenerated to that sometimes, and I also think there was a bit of an adversarial approach by councillors towards the mayor of the day. I remember Councillor Juliet Arkwright came in for some quite rough treatment when she was elected for the first 2 years of that council. Yeah.
And in your view, was that within the bounds of the cut and thrust of local government politics, or in your view, was it beyond the bounds of what was?
Look, I understood that people from time to time got possibly a bit heated or upset, and I mean, there is an amount of give and take that you can give, but there were councillors who were, on an ongoing basis, they were disruptive.
And in respect of your experience on the heritage and environmental committees, did any of the disruption or disrespect carry over into those meetings, or were they?
No, it didn't seem to. I mean, I was on a couple of committees that I felt ran very well, and that was one of them, the Heritage Committee and the Environment Committee, and they were largely immune from that disruption at the council meetings, and they actually achieved some very good outcomes for council, I believe.
Can I ask you about your experience of the way the governing body interacted with the public, firstly during at least the last term that you're involved, 2012 to 2016?
Well, there had been some community members who were regular attendees at council, and some of them actually didn't help the meeting process at all. They interrupted the meeting. They got up and made comments about councillors, and I think that possibly led to some restrictions on the question time that members of the public enjoyed.
And can I just start with the 2012-2016 term for a start? Did you detect as a councillor and as a member of the community any particular dissatisfaction with the way that councillors were interacting with the community in that 2012 to 2016 period?
Just to be clear, did I express?
Did you experience, or either personally, or did you pick up a general vibe in the community in that term about community dissatisfaction with council?
Yeah, I think meetings were not. Council didn't put its best face on at the meetings. They were. There were meetings where I felt quite dispirited and almost ashamed to be sitting in the room as a councillor, because some of the behaviour was very poor, I thought.
What sort of things, what sort of behaviour do you have in mind in giving that answer?
Well, one councillor, when he was elected on that term, first elected on that term, he took it upon himself to constantly question, attack, make points of order against, ask questions with notice. This other particular councillor, Councillor Uliana, and I thought it was a pointless exercise because it didn't advance any council matter. It just appeared to be a personal, I won't use the word attack, but it was a personal campaign against this other councillor. So I thought that was entirely a waste of time for all of us to have to endure, and it went on from meeting to meeting to meeting, and it was never resolved right to the end of that term.
In your experience in that 2012-2016 term, did you generally feel like the meetings were well chaired, or did the lack of resolution of behaviour that you were just talking about feed into the sense that there was an effective chairing of meetings?
Depending on the subject, some of the meetings were well chaired, but I did gain the impression that there were alliances on council, as you might expect, and there was probably given leeway to some councillors who were in alliance with the person chairing the meeting, and that was a bit disappointing to see that someone would be given more leeway than someone else. I found that a bit dispiriting.
You've mentioned a couple of times now a sense of being dispirited. Did that play into your role, your decision, I should say, to not contest a fourth term in 2016?
Yes, it did.
More generally, and by all means, if you don't feel like you can answer, tell me, but more generally, did you feel that the conduct of council deterred people from putting themselves up as candidates at elections?
Well, before I was elected in 2004, I attended council meetings for a couple of years, and I might have asked the occasional question from the floor, but I didn't. Sorry, back to your question. I've lost myself here.
That's right.
Can you repeat that?
Sure. Do you have any impression or knowledge as to whether the conduct of councillors, which led to your sense of being dispirited, deterred other people from running as candidates in local government?
That was my point. I went to council meetings and I observed the council meetings, and I thought I might have a role here, I might be able to contribute. And so I had a cause to reflect on what a person who came to a meeting might think in that last term, and if I had been coming to the meetings with a view to being on council, I don't think I would have run for council after that. It was very adversarial and quite a rough environment.
Can you tell the Commission whether you had any experience in the behaviour of councillors in committee meetings during the 2016 to 2020 term?
When you say committee meetings, you mean like finance committee?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, there was. Yes, there definitely was instances of even briefings where it got quite heated, and I couldn't understand why it got so heated about these briefings. It was like quite unnecessary for people to get upset to that extent over a briefing, and there was anger shown towards council staff, which I thought was quite unfair. Don't shoot the messenger if you don't like the message. That was my feeling. So yeah, especially in that last term, things were not ideal. The atmosphere was not ideal, and I think it detracted from the way council performed, even though I think council had performed well financially, and development applications got through, but council was battling against this sort of headwind of people not helping the situation, like causing problems. To me, it was quite remarkable that individuals would choose to behave that way and disrupt council operation, really.
I was referring there to the 2016-2020 term. I take it you're giving your experience of the 2012-2016.
I wasn't referring to the 16-20.
No,
I was
that's okay.
referring to my last term.
Thank you, that's still useful evidence. The conduct of councillors that you've described in meetings in 2012-2016 and in briefing sessions in 2012-2016, did some of those councillors get re-elected in 2016?
They did. I think, 6 of the 9 got re-elected. So some of the problems remained there and continued on, I believe.
And just going back to my question before, did you experience any, did you have any experience of behaviour in committee meetings in the 2016-2020 term, or were you not involved at that stage as a member of public in any of those meetings?
I wasn't involved anymore in committees and that sort of thing, so I couldn't really comment on what happened in that term.
Okay, thank you. You made the observation that the process of dealing with misbehaviour on council was poorly handled and that individuals were not sanctioned for their disruptive behaviour at the time. Are you referring there to your experiences in 2012-16 or things you heard and things you experienced in the latest term, 2016 to 2020?
Well, I think that last term of council for me was the one that I referred to there. I think if I said poorly handled, I think it was. I think there was amount of leeway shown, not by staff, but by perhaps some of the mayors there earlier on, particularly. As I said before, I think that some of those councillors were given leeway perhaps because they were supporters. I don't know. That was my opinion. You know, at a meeting they could misbehave and perhaps not get sanctioned by the mayor of the day because they were, you know, in the faction that the mayor might have been part of. So it was kind of, in a sense, allowed that behaviour. So I didn't think staff, I thought staff handled it as well as they could because they couldn't really intervene in political matters. So it's quite a quandary to be a manager and have to deal with that at meetings. So quite a dilemma for them.
Yes. Commissioner, I didn't have any other specific questions at this stage.
Mr. Clark, do I take it from your evidence that problems of this kind persisted from your very first term on council?
Well, it was different. My first term there was 12 councillors and one councillor had a group of 5 councillors. So, and they had supporters as well, so they fairly well had the numbers on council. So they pretty much controlled the meetings, and the mayor was a supporter of theirs, so it was a clear delineation. No other group had the numbers. I mean, I felt I was treated fairly by the mayor in that first council, and I felt I got a say. So even though that first council it had its moments as well, things got resolved, I think. So
do I take it then that the issues that you saw first started to appear in the 2008 council?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think. Sometimes you forget who was
Yes.
on the council, and I've written myself a little cheat sheet here to remember.
Oh, I might ask you to send it to me.
Yeah. Well, as I said, I've just spoken about the first term, and the second term, by then it had gone down to 9 councillors, and there were some characters on that council who were they were eccentric, but they were generally the meetings got conducted reasonably well. You know, even though we did have our problems at times, I just felt that the last council I was on, it deteriorated, and I didn't feel that it was fair, really, that should happen. And I think
But not just fair, not just to other councillors, but what about the community?
well, indeed, the communities. I've always felt that the council managed to run despite some of this behaviour by councillors, and
Yes.
I sort of pay tribute to the staff for making sure that council managed to be ticking over despite some of the problems. But I don't know.
I don't think you put it in this way, but the fact that the staff were able to keep the council ticking over in spite of the behaviour is perhaps a testament to the staff working solutions around what was happening at council level. Is that?
Well, that depends what you mean. Are you talking about senior staff, or are you talking about... I was talking about council in general, like operations.
I see. All right. I was picking up...
the senior management level.
I understand.
Yeah.
I was picking up your reference to the staff. So when you're speaking of staff, you're speaking below senior management level.
Yeah, not the executive. I think it's probably good that council separated in that respect, and they're, the operational staff managed to work despite all those problems, but the senior staff were sort of besieged by, certainly in that last term, I feel like they were besieged by councillors.
In 2012 to 16?
Yeah, I'm sorry to jump backwards and forwards, but
yes.
Yeah, in that council, the executive were besieged by councillors. I mean, the demands that some councillors put on the executive were quite extraordinary.
The fact that this had persisted through to your observation from the 2012 term, and ultimately it's a matter for me to determine...
From talking to my
yes.
my colleagues, yeah, I understand that it did, yeah.
Yes. Doesn't that tell one that something had to change here?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
The fact that you're describing these observations from the 2012 term, and you've had some reports from your colleagues about similar issues in the 2016 term.
Yes.
Doesn't that indicate that something had to change here?
Well, yes, it did indicate that. But I'm not sure that some of the councillors were fit for purpose, really, and I mean that's a matter for the community to
It is.
decide that. But when councillors get returned and they were disruptive on one council, and they return again and are still disruptive, it becomes very difficult for senior staff to cope with that. How do you cope with it? Do you, surely the political side of it has to operate, and I don't know, we had officials from the ALG come to a lot of meetings, and I think there was a kind of expectations that they would somehow resolve the issues, come up with a magic solution. But and I think even my expectations were that if there was a problem, that an individual councillor could be dismissed. But and I probably thought that in the term after mine that should have happened. But from what's been said, I understand that it was very difficult. If it, as you said, I think one out, all out. Well,
I don't think they were my words, but I have raised in my opening if someone can point me to the provision of the Act that would allow that, the Minister to take action like that, I'd be very interested to have that assistance.
Yeah.
Seems to be a view that's been expressed, but at the moment I'm not sure where that view is coming from. But I think the passage, the phrase one out, all out, was something that was said by a witness.
Well, I may have misunderstood that.
Yes, no, it's quite all right. Yes, I think I have the understanding of your evidence. Mr. Parrish, does anything arise from that?
One thing,
Yes.
Commissioner, I would be interested to know if you have a view whether you think the appointment of a local planning panel has and will assist in the functioning of the governing body by taking planning matters, some planning matters, most planning matters out of the hands of...
I certainly have a view on that, and it's probably not a majority view. We dealt with a lot of controversial developments in my time on council, and a lot of them were resolved after much wrangling and toing and froing. And I'll give an example of that, of the BW development in Mittagong. That was on my first term of council. That was very problematic, and there was kind of a view by the majority of the council, as it turned out, that development should be approved. I probably had a different view, but I mean, the majority vote is what wins out, and that proposal was approved. But I think it was resolved, and maybe not to my ideal satisfaction, but it was resolved. And there were a number of other projects, I mean, large projects like the indoor pool here, and prior to that, they wanted to have a regional leisure centre. They were resolved on council. It was a difficult process, but we went through and resolved it. I was a bit disappointed, to get back to your question, I guess, the planning panels. I was disappointed that, well, disappointed maybe not the word, just an overused word, isn't it? Disappointed. That there was no consultation with the community when the local planning panel was introduced. It was, to me, it was a retrograde step, and I didn't feel that there was any consultation with the community. Okay, in the short term, development applications had to continue and be dealt with, but I feel that the community really needed a say on planning panels, and I'm assuming that the planning panel will remain and the council will not be determining those applications. So I think the community really needs some input to that. I mean, okay, we have some local representatives who might, you know, or a pool of representatives who might appear from time to time, but they're largely not dealt by councillors from that community, and I felt that was a backward step. And I don't believe the community should have to suffer not having this personal representation as a direct result of the behaviour of what I consider to be a relatively small group of councillors. I mean, I guess that's probably an oversimplification, but you know, that's my view.
We've had some evidence that there was a perception, at least, that the 2016-2020 council was bogged down on individual DAs, and that prevented the effective conduct of meetings. And we've also had some evidence that there is a perception from at least some in the community that the handling of DAs by council led to a capricious approach where you could lobby or know someone and that would help get your DA through. At least from a procedural sense rather than the consultation sense, do you think there is some value in a local planning panel? I'm interested in your experience as a councillor who sat through 3 terms dealing with.
Well, I think some of the senior staff were still there on the development side of it. I think there was a difference of opinion on, even within council staff, about planning panels. The community needs to be heard on development applications, but I was a bit of a loss to explain why favouritism was raised by some complainants. I didn't really experience favouritism being given towards applicants, and I don't know.
I think, Mr. Clark, the issue is not necessarily that it happened, that perhaps because of the processes adopted in considering DAs at council meetings, there was a perception, not actual, a perception that might be happening because of what were perceived to be inconsistencies in approach when DAs came to be dealt with at council level. And I think what Council Assisting is seeking to explore with you, acknowledging your earlier evidence, is do you think, as a matter of process and form, that a local planning panel can go some way to addressing those issues of perception? Do you follow?
Well, I guess a planning panel will take councillors out of the equation, but it doesn't address the issue that the council, that the community doesn't have councillor representation. I live at Bundanoon. If there was going to be a development there, people would approach me and ask me about it, to give them some information on how they should approach it. Sure, there is steps that the community can make submissions, but to me and I've made submissions since I've left council on proposals out my way, but it's just a bit like you're putting in a submission, you get minimal information, you go online and have a look at the plans, and you put in a submission, and that's pretty much it. You don't get the involvement that you would get going to a council meeting and seeing who's voting for what and the debate about it. I mean, you can go to a planning panel, I guess, but I just think it removes the local from local government to be doing that.
Yes,
So
I understand.
as far as the state government's concerned, sure, it's a lot neater. You know, it gets development applications through quicker, but it's not just about the speed of getting development applications through, it's about good developmental outcomes. So, yeah, I guess I have my reservations, and we'll see how it goes, but that was a great disappointment to me. The consultation with the community about that, I think, should have been much more, much greater and further teased out, because the previous council has been criticised for not consulting with the community, and here we have a situation where a planning panel is imposed and there's no debate in the community. I guess that was part of the package, wasn't it? So anyway, I'll leave that.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Parrish.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. Is there any other matters you wish to address the Commissioner on within the terms of reference?
Yeah, my comments or conclusion, I suppose, call it what you will, that are related to the 4th terms of reference, and also personal reflection. I had 12 years on council, and I learnt quite a lot on council. I was quite dismayed when it was put into administration. I had a good relationship with the staff and the executive council, and initially I thought the administration period would be reasonable, would be limited to 6 months and not drag on indefinitely. I felt the community needed some needs representation from council, even though some of those councils had been problematic. This council has been removed, and the next council hopefully will perform better, but I believe that the community does need that local representation. It's not just about, I mean, a number of people came and said that their DAs, they weren't dealt with quickly. Well, it's not just dealing with a development quickly, it's also getting a good outcome, development outcome, that suits the whole community, not just that individual applicant. So that's a comment I've got there. The other thing is I feel for the council staff having to cope with council going into administration. It's a great reputational stain on a council to have that. And to me, a handful of councils really serve themselves, put themselves in front of the community and put themselves ahead of the community, and that was a pretty bad outcome. I don't believe the community should suffer from that. And I think
In saying that, though, the community deserves effective civic leadership, do they not?
Sorry.
That's all right. It's quite all right. In making that observation, you'd agree with the proposition, I take it, that the community needs and is entitled to effective civic leadership from the governing body?
Oh yes, certainly they are entitled to that.
Yes.
But as in life, as is often the way, the lowest common denominator determine how people are treated. And if people make a nuisance of themselves at council meetings, well, that has effect on the whole community. And I'm just pretty sad that it should come to this. And I think hopefully an electric council will be restored sooner than later, but I have a feeling it may be later rather than sooner.
Well, yes, I understand those views. Some of them fall outside my terms of reference, but
I guess that's just a personal observation.
No, that's quite all right. Had you finished?
I have finished. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yes. Are there any applications? No. Mr. Clark, thank you for your attendance this morning, and thank you for reorganising yourself to be here today.
No problem.
It's very much appreciated. You're excused from further attendance under your summons and free to go. Mr. Parrish, I take it that ends our witnesses for today?
Yes, it does for today.
All right, are we back on a more normal footing from tomorrow? As far as you're aware, as of this moment?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
And an updated list can be posted to the website today?
Yes.
Yes, all right. Is there anything else I need to deal with?
No, I'd just like to reiterate and echo your thanks of Mr. Clark for rearranging his schedule for us.
Yes, yes. As I've said a number of times, taking people away from their ordinary business to answer a summons is something that I appreciate is of inconvenience to them. So particularly for someone who was expecting to come later has come today, that's very much appreciated. All right, if there's nothing further, I'll adjourn until 10 a.m. tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.